It was the 1st of July, 2023, and the summer camp was alive with the usual chatter and laughter of the campers. I had just settled into my bunk when the phone rang for the first time. It was a strange time for a call, well past midnight, and the sound echoed eerily through the quiet cabin. I picked it up hesitantly, but there was only silence on the other end. I listened for a moment, my heartbeat quickening, but eventually I hung up, brushing it off as a wrong number. Yet, the uneasy feeling lingered, making it hard to fall asleep. The next night, the phone rang again at the same time. This time, I answered immediately, my hands trembling slightly as I held the receiver to my ear. Again, there was only silence, but it felt different, heavier, more menacing. I glanced around the dark room, half expecting to see someone lurking in the shadows, but there was nothing. The camp, usually so comforting with its crackling campfires and friendly faces, suddenly felt oppressive, as if something unseen was watching. As the days went by, the calls became a nightly occurrence. Each time, the silence on the other end grew more unsettling. The camp's surroundings, once filled with the sounds of nature, rustling leaves, distant animal cries, now seemed filled with whispers just beyond my hearing. The other campers noticed nothing unusual, going about their days with carefree smiles, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. Sleep eluded me, and when I did manage to doze off, I was plagued by strange, disjointed dreams that left me more exhausted than before. One night, as I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, the phone rang again. My heart pounded in my chest as I reached for it, my hand trembling uncontrollably. This time, I listened intently, straining to hear anything that might explain the source of these calls. But there was nothing, just the sound of my own breathing, growing faster and more panicked with each passing second. I couldn't take it anymore. I threw the phone down, my body shaking with fear and frustration. I knew I had to do something, but what? The camp, once a place of joy and laughter, now felt like a prison, and I was trapped inside, unable to escape the mounting terror. By the end of the week, the calls had taken their toll on me. I was a nervous wreck, jumping at every small sound and avoiding the phone like it was cursed. The other campers began to notice my strange behavior, but I couldn't bring myself to explain. How could I? How could I tell them that every night I was tormented by something I couldn't see or understand? The nights were the worst. Long, silent hours filled with fear and anticipation, waiting for the phone to ring again. And it always did, right on cue, at the same time every night, as if it was taunting me, daring me to uncover the truth. The next night, the anticipation was unbearable. I lay in bed, staring at the phone, waiting for the inevitable ring. My mind raced with thoughts of what could be behind the calls. Was it a prank? A warning? Something more sinister? The camp had never felt so isolated. The dark woods surrounding us now seemed to close in, trapping me in a nightmare of my own making. As the clock struck midnight, the phone rang again, its shrill tone cutting through the silence like a knife. I answered immediately, my hands trembling so violently that I nearly dropped the receiver. The silence was there again, oppressive and heavy, as if someone was on the other end, listening to me, watching me. My heart pounded in my chest, and I found myself whispering into the phone, asking who was there, begging for an answer. But there was nothing, just the sound of my own breath, ragged and uneven, echoing back at me. I couldn't stand it anymore. I slammed the phone down and bolted upright, my mind made up. The campgrounds were eerily quiet as I stepped outside. The only sounds were the soft rustling of leaves and the distant calls of night animals. The moon hung low in the sky, casting long shadows that seemed to move and shift as I walked. I felt a chill run down my spine, but I forced myself to keep going, driven by a mixture of fear and determination. The calls had to be coming from somewhere within the camp, and I was determined to find the source. I started by checking the other cabins, creeping silently through the dark, peering into windows and listening for any sounds of movement. But everything was still. The campers all fast asleep, unaware of the torment I was going through. My frustration grew with each passing minute, the tension in my chest tightening like a vice. As I moved further away from the main camp area, I noticed something unusual. A faint, flickering light coming from the woods behind the campfire site. With my heart in my throat, I followed the light, the darkness of the forest swallowing me whole. The trees loomed tall and menacing, their branches reaching out like skeletal fingers, and the underbrush crackled beneath my feet. The light grew brighter as I approached, until I found myself standing in front of an old, dilapidated cabin that I had never seen before. The door was slightly ajar, the light spilling out in a thin, eerie beam. I hesitated for a moment, every instinct screaming at me to turn back, to run. But I couldn't. I had to know what was inside. With a deep breath, I pushed the door open, the hinges creaking loudly in the stillness of the night. The inside of the cabin was dimly lit, cluttered with old, dusty furniture and strange, unidentifiable objects. My eyes were drawn to a small table in the corner, where an old rotary phone sat, its receiver off the hook, the dial spinning slowly on its own. I stood frozen in the doorway, my eyes locked on the phone. It looked ancient, out of place in the modern world, yet here it was, spinning its dial slowly as if possessed. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. The atmosphere in the cabin was suffocating, the air thick with dust and an overwhelming sense of dread. I could hear my heart pounding in my ears, each beat louder than the last as I took a hesitant step forward, drawn toward the phone as if by some unseen force. As I approached the table, I noticed something else, a symbol etched into the wood, strange and unfamiliar. It looked like a combination of geometric shapes and odd, curling lines, almost like something you'd see in an old book of spells. The sight of it sent a shiver down my spine, but I couldn't tear my eyes away. The closer I got, the more I felt an overwhelming sense of being watched, like there was someone or something in the room with me, just out of sight. The phone continued its slow, deliberate spinning, the soft clicking of the dial the only sound in the room. I reached out, my hand trembling, and lifted the receiver to my ear. There was no dial tone, just a heavy, oppressive silence. My breath caught in my throat as I listened, straining to hear anything, any whisper, any sign of life. And then, faintly, I heard it, a distant, rhythmic thumping, like the beating of a heart, echoing through the line. My blood ran cold. I wanted to drop the phone, to run out of that cabin and never look back, but I was rooted to the spot, unable to move. The thumping grew louder, more insistent, as if it were coming from right inside my head. I squeezed my eyes shut, trying to block out the sound, but it was no use. It was everywhere, surrounding me, suffocating me. Panic surged through me, and I finally managed to drop the receiver. the clattering sound breaking the eerie silence. I stumbled back, desperate to put distance between myself and that cursed phone. But as I turned to leave, something caught my eye. An old, tattered diary lying open on the floor, as if it had been placed there for me to find. My curiosity, despite my terror, got the better of me. I picked it up, the pages brittle and yellowed with age, and began to read. The handwriting was shaky, the ink faded, but the words were clear. July 15th, 1978. The calls won't stop. They know where I am. They're coming for me. My heart skipped a beat. The diary belonged to someone who had been here before, someone who had gone through the same torment I was now experiencing. As I flipped through the pages, the entries became more frantic, more desperate, describing the same phone calls, the same feeling of being watched, until the entries abruptly stopped. The final words were scribbled hastily, almost illegible. I can't escape. They're here. I stood in the dim light of the cabin, clutching the diary in my trembling hands. The words on the page blurred as fear clouded my vision. The weight of the previous camper's terror pressing down on me like a physical force. They had faced the same calls, the same creeping dread that now gripped me, and they hadn't escaped. The air in the cabin grew colder, each breath I took sending chills through my body. I knew I had to leave, but something kept me rooted to the spot, an invisible tether holding me in place. The phone, now silent, seemed to pulse with a life of its own, as if it was waiting for me to pick up the receiver again. But I couldn't bring myself to do it. Instead, I turned my attention back to the diary, flipping to the last few pages. The entries were more erratic, the handwriting barely legible, describing how the camper had started hearing whispers, faint voices calling out to them in the dead of night. The more they tried to ignore it, the louder the voices became, until they could no longer distinguish them from their own thoughts. I felt a growing sense of dread as I read on, the words painting a picture of a mind unraveling under the weight of fear. The camper had discovered a hidden path in the forest, just as I had, and had followed it to this very cabin. They described the same eerie symbols, the same oppressive silence that now filled the room. And then, just as they had begun to uncover the truth, the entries stopped. There was no explanation, no conclusion, just a void where their story should have ended. The silence in the cabin was suffocating, the air thick with an unseen presence. I could feel it now, stronger than ever, a cold, malevolent force watching me from the shadows. The walls seemed to close in around me, the darkness pressing against my skin. My thoughts raced, trying to make sense of everything, but all I could focus on was the final entry in the diary. I'm not alone. They're here. They're always here. A sudden, overwhelming sense of dread washed over me, as if those words had reached out from the past to wrap their cold fingers around my heart. I had to get out of there. I knew it deep in my bones. But as I turned to leave, the phone rang again, its shrill tone cutting through the silence like a knife. My breath caught in my throat, and for a moment, I was paralyzed, unable to move or think. The sound echoed in my head, growing louder and more insistent with each passing second. Against my better judgment, I reached for the receiver, my hand shaking uncontrollably. I lifted it to my ear, expecting the same oppressive silence. But this time, there was something else. A faint, barely audible whisper, like a voice carried on the wind. I couldn't make out the words, but the tone was unmistakable. Pleading, desperate, terrified. My heart pounded in my chest as I strained to listen, but the voice faded away, leaving only a cold, empty silence. I realized then that the camper's spirit had never left this place. They were trapped, just as I was, caught in an endless cycle of fear and despair. The realization hit me like a wave, washing over me with a cold, sinking dread. The camper's spirit was still here, trapped in this place, caught in an endless loop of fear. I had to help them. Somehow, I knew that if I didn't, I would end up just like them, forever haunted by the phone calls, the whispers, the oppressive silence. I took a deep breath, trying to steady my nerves, and decided to confront whatever was behind this. The only way out was through. I carefully set the diary down on the table, my eyes darting around the cabin, searching for any clue that might help. The phone lay silent now, but its presence felt stronger than ever, as if it was watching me, waiting for my next move. I turned my attention back to the strange symbol carved into the table. It seemed to pulse with a dark energy, drawing me closer. I knew I had to do something with it, something to break the cycle and free the spirit trapped here. I traced the symbol with my fingers, feeling a strange warmth emanating from it. My mind raced, trying to remember anything I'd ever heard about symbols, spirits, and rituals. And then, a memory surfaced. A story I'd heard long ago about how certain symbols could be used to bind or release spirits. I wasn't sure if it was true, but it was the only lead I had. I closed my eyes, focusing on the symbol, and began to speak, my voice trembling but firm. I didn't know what words to say, so I spoke from my heart, asking for the spirit to be released, to find peace, and move on from this place. The air around me grew colder, and the room seemed to darken, as if the very walls were closing in. I felt a presence, strong and overwhelming, pressing down on me. The weight of it was almost unbearable, but I kept speaking, my voice growing stronger as I poured all my emotion into the words. The symbol beneath my fingers began to glow faintly, a soft, warm light spreading outwards, pushing back the darkness. The oppressive silence was broken by a low hum, rising in pitch until it became a sharp, clear tone that filled the room. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, it was over. The light faded, the air grew warm again, and the oppressive presence lifted. The cabin was still and quiet, but it no longer felt menacing. I could feel that the spirit had moved on, finally freed from whatever had held it here for so long. A profound sense of relief washed over me, and I realized that for the first time in weeks, I could breathe easily. The weight that had pressed down on my chest was gone, and the fear that had gripped me so tightly had loosened its hold. As I stepped out of the cabin, the first light of dawn was breaking over the horizon, casting a warm, golden glow over the camp. The forest, once dark and foreboding, now seemed peaceful and inviting. I knew that whatever had happened here was over, that the spirit had found peace. I felt a deep sense of satisfaction and closure, knowing that I had done the right thing. The phone calls had stopped. The terror was over, and the camp was once again a place of safety and comfort. That final night at camp was calm and uneventful. I slept soundly for the first time in weeks, my dreams filled with light. When I woke up the next morning, I knew that I had been through something that had changed me forever. As I packed my bags and prepared to leave, I took one last look at the camp, feeling a strange mixture of sadness and gratitude. The experience had been terrifying, but it had also taught me something valuable. Sometimes, facing our fears is the only way to overcome them. It was the 4th of August, and the summer camp had settled into its usual rhythm. The days were filled with activities and laughter, but as night fell, an unsettling silence crept in. I had just returned to my cabin after the evening bonfire when the phone rang. The sound cut through the quiet like a knife, startling me. I glanced at the clock, 11:30 p.m. Odd, I thought. Who could be calling at this hour? I hesitated before picking up the receiver, feeling a strange sense of dread. The line crackled softly, but there was no sound, just an oppressive, suffocating silence. I waited, my heart pounding in my chest, but the silence stretched on, growing more intense with each passing second. I whispered a tentative, "Hello," into the phone, but there was no response. The only sound was the faint static that seemed to grow louder, more ominous, with every breath I took. I hung up, trying to shake off the uneasy feeling, but the silence of the night felt heavier now, pressing down on me. The next morning, I tried to forget about the call, convincing myself it was just a prank or a wrong number. But deep down, I knew something wasn't right. As the day wore on, the memory of the silence on the other end gnawed at me, a constant reminder that something was out of place. I found myself glancing at the phone more often, half expecting it to ring again. And when it didn't, I felt a strange mix of relief and anxiety. The camp was bustling with life, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something dark was lurking just out of sight. That night, as the clock inched closer to midnight, the air in the cabin grew thick with tension. I sat on my bed, staring at the phone, dreading the possibility of it ringing again. The minutes ticked by slowly, each one more agonizing than the last. And then, just as I was about to drift off to sleep, the phone rang again. The sound was jarring, sending a shock of fear through me. I stared at it, my hands trembling, before I finally reached out and answered. The silence on the other end was even more intense this time, almost deafening in its stillness. I could hear my own breath, shallow and quick, echoing back at me. I wanted to hang up, to end the call and forget this ever happened, but something kept me holding on, waiting for something, anything, to break the silence. But it never came. The oppressive quiet seemed to seep into my bones, freezing me in place. Finally, I forced myself to hang up, the click of the receiver echoing loudly in the stillness of the cabin. As I lay in bed, unable to sleep, I felt a growing sense of paranoia. The camp, once a place of joy and laughter, now felt sinister, as if something unseen was watching, waiting. The silence of the night was no longer comforting. It was suffocating, filled with an unseen menace that I couldn't escape. I knew I had to find out who was behind the calls, but the thought of confronting whatever was out there filled me with dread. Sleep eluded me, and I spent the rest of the night wide awake, listening to the silence, waiting for the phone to ring again. The following day, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. The camp continued its routine, hiking, swimming, and the usual activities, but my mind was elsewhere. Every time I looked at the phone, a shiver ran down my spine, as if it held some dark secret just out of reach. I tried to focus on the day's events, but the memory of the silent calls hung over me like a shadow. The other campers seemed oblivious, their laughter and chatter a stark contrast to the anxiety gnawing at me. That evening, I noticed something strange. The phone calls only came when I was alone. During the day, When the cabin was full of noise and people, the phone remained silent. But as soon as I found myself alone, the anxiety would return, creeping up on me like a cold draft. I began to feel as though I was being watched, the sensation growing stronger with each passing hour. My senses were heightened. Every creak of the cabin, every rustle of the leaves outside sent my heart racing. As night fell, I returned to my cabin, trying to ignore the growing sense of dread. The phone sat silently on the table, but I knew it was only a matter of time before it rang again. I tried to distract myself, reading a book under the dim light of the lamp, but my eyes kept drifting back to the phone. The hours dragged on, the tension building until it was nearly unbearable. And then, just as I had expected, the phone rang. Its shrill tone cutting through the quiet like a knife. I answered with a shaking hand, the silence on the other end immediately filling me with a sense of unease. But this time, there was something different. It wasn't just silence. I could hear faint, indistinct noises, like whispers carried on the wind. They were too quiet to make out, but the tone was unmistakable. Urgent, desperate. A chill ran down my spine, and I strained to listen, hoping to catch some fragment of what was being said. But the harder I listened, the more the whispers faded, until there was nothing left but the oppressive silence. I hung up, my hands trembling. The atmosphere in the cabin had changed. What was once a place of comfort now felt like a trap, the walls closing in around me. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, the unseen presence growing stronger. I knew I needed help, but who would believe me? The idea of explaining this to someone else seemed impossible, and the fear of being dismissed as paranoid kept me silent. I spent the rest of the night in a state of heightened alertness, every sound amplified in the quiet darkness. The whispers from the phone echoed in my mind, each one a fragment of a puzzle I couldn't solve. As dawn broke, I was exhausted, but sleep was impossible. My thoughts were consumed by the calls, the whispers, and the growing fear that something was out there, something that knew me, that watched me, and that wasn't going to stop. The following day, I felt like I was moving through a fog, my thoughts slow and clouded by exhaustion. The sun was bright, the camp full of life, but I was disconnected, caught in the grip of a fear that I couldn't shake. I decided to do some digging, hoping to find any clue that might explain the strange phone calls. I started with the camp's history, asking around casually, hoping to uncover something without raising suspicion. But the counselors and other campers didn't know anything unusual, at least not that they were willing to share. Later that afternoon, while sorting through some old newspapers in the camp's library, I found something that sent a chill down my spine. An article, dated August 4th, 1992, detailed a mysterious incident at the camp, a series of unexplained phone calls that had terrorized the staff and campers. The article described the same eerie silence, the same whispers, and the same feeling of being watched. It ended abruptly, with no explanation, just a note that the calls had stopped as suddenly as they had begun, leaving everyone unsettled but relieved. My heart raced as I read and reread the article. Could this be happening again? And why me? The idea that I wasn't the first to experience these calls filled me with a strange mix of fear and determination. The atmosphere in the camp, once filled with the sounds of laughter and nature, now felt oppressive, as if the weight of those past events hung in the air, unseen but deeply felt. I could sense that whatever had happened before wasn't over. It had just been waiting. That night, I returned to my cabin with the article still clutched in my hand. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the camp, and the familiar sense of dread settled over me like a heavy blanket. I tried to prepare myself for the inevitable. Another call, another night of fear. But nothing could truly prepare me for what was coming. As the minutes ticked by, the tension grew unbearable, the quiet of the night filling my head with 1,000 dark possibilities. And then, right on cue, the phone rang. This time, I hesitated, my hand hovering over the receiver. The article's words echoed in my mind, warning me, urging me to leave it alone. But I couldn't. I had to know. I picked up the phone, and for a moment, there was nothing, just the familiar silence. But then, a voice, faint and distorted, broke through. It was barely a whisper, but I could hear the words, clear and chilling. "You're not alone." My blood ran cold. I wanted to scream, to run, but I was frozen in place, the receiver pressed to my ear. The voice repeated the phrase, each word dripping with a cold, menacing certainty. I slammed the phone down, my heart pounding in my chest. The room felt smaller, darker, as if the walls were closing in around me. I realized, with a growing sense of horror, that the voice was right. I wasn't alone. Something was here, watching, waiting, and it wasn't going to stop until it had what it wanted. I spent the rest of that night wide awake, the chilling words from the phone call echoing in my mind. "You're not alone." Sleep was impossible. Every creak of the cabin, every rustle of the trees outside felt like a threat. The darkness seemed thicker, almost tangible, as if it was alive and closing in on me. I knew I had to find out more about the calls, what they meant, who or what was behind them. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized that I might not want to know the answers. The next morning, I felt a strange sense of urgency. I couldn't stay in the cabin, couldn't wait for the phone to ring again. I needed answers. I remembered the article and the mention of an old abandoned section of the camp that had been closed off for years. The article didn't give details, but I was certain that the truth lay there, hidden in the shadows of the past. I set out early, before anyone else was awake, determined to find whatever secrets the camp was hiding. As I made my way through the campgrounds, the familiar paths soon gave way to overgrown trails and thick underbrush. The trees here were taller, their branches twisted and gnarled, blocking out most of the sunlight. The air was cooler, damp, and carried the faint scent of decay. I pushed through the undergrowth, my heart racing as I drew closer to the place the article had hinted at. Finally, after what felt like hours, I stumbled upon it. A dilapidated, forgotten cabin, half hidden by the forest. The cabin looked ancient, its wood weathered and gray, the windows broken and covered with ivy. The door hung ajar, creaking softly in the breeze. I hesitated, every instinct telling me to turn back, but I couldn't stop now. I stepped inside, the floorboards groaning under my weight. The air inside was thick with dust and the smell of rot, and the dim light filtering through the broken windows cast long, eerie shadows across the room. In the center of the cabin, I found a small, old-fashioned telephone, just like the one in my cabin. It was sitting on a wooden table, surrounded by strange objects, old, rusted tools, a dusty mirror, and a few tattered photographs. The phone was off the hook, the receiver lying next to it, as if someone had just used it. My pulse quickened as I approached the table, the atmosphere growing more oppressive with each step. I reached out to touch the phone, my fingers trembling. But before I could, the phone in my pocket rang. The sudden sound made me jump, my heart nearly stopping in my chest. I fumbled for my phone, my hands shaking so badly I could barely hold it. I answered, and immediately, the same eerie, oppressive silence filled the line. But this time, it was different. There was no static, no faint whispers, just an overwhelming, suffocating quiet. And then, just as I was about to hang up, the voice returned, low and distorted. "You found it." The words sent a chill down my spine, and I felt a cold sweat break out across my forehead. I turned around, half expecting to see someone standing behind me, but there was no one, only the empty, decaying cabin. The voice on the phone continued, barely above a whisper, "You can't leave now." The call ended abruptly, leaving me in a silence that was almost more terrifying than the voice itself. I dropped the phone, my hands shaking uncontrollably. I knew then that I was trapped, just like the campers before me. And whatever was behind these calls wasn't done with me yet. The cabin felt smaller, the walls closing in as the reality of my situation sank in. I was trapped, caught in the web of whatever malevolent force had been haunting this camp for decades. My breath came in shallow gasps, my heart pounding in my chest as I tried to think of a way out. The phone on the table seemed to pulse with dark energy, the silence in the room pressing down on me like a physical weight. I knew I had to leave, but every fiber of my being felt rooted to the spot, paralyzed by fear. I took a step toward the door, my legs trembling, when the phone on the table rang. The sound was sharp, slicing through the oppressive silence. I froze, staring at the receiver as it rattled against the wood. The urge to run was overwhelming, but something kept me there, something deep inside me that needed to know the truth. I reached out, my hand hovering over the receiver, and finally, with a deep breath, I picked it up. This time, there was no silence. The voice came through immediately, clear and direct, yet still distorted and unsettling. "It's too late," it said, the words sending a cold shiver down my spine. "You can't change what's been done." I tried to speak, but my throat was dry. The words stuck in my chest. The voice continued, relentless. "We've been waiting for you. It's your turn now." My blood ran cold as the finality of those words sank in. The line went dead, and I dropped the receiver, backing away from the table. I had to get out, but as I turned toward the door, I saw it, an old dusty mirror hanging on the wall. And in its reflection, I wasn't alone.